On the 14th of April 2022, Nikon announced a host of updates, including a Z9 firmware update, a Z6 Z7 firmware update, the release of a 660 gig CFexpress card,
and MC-N10 Remote Grip.
So we're going to talk about all of those new releases right now. So let's talk Z9 firmware update first. It has been touted as the most groundbreaking firmware we've seen for the Z9 yet, bearing in mind that we've had two firmware updates so far, a 1.10 and a 1.11, which were kind of mostly bug fixes rather than feature additions. This has actually added a host of new features to the video capability of the Z9.
As well as steals.
So there's some features that we wanted to highlight for you. Obviously, you can and are welcome to read the wall of text that Nikon have supplied for this firmware update. But let's actually break some of these down so you can see what they're all about in a nutshell.
All right, so let's start with steals first, and then we're going to move on to the videos. And then it's going to be a brief one. We're also going to give you a list of essential videos to watch about in detail, people who tackle a wall of text and tell you exactly what's happening. They also had a hands-on with the firmware update. We didn't, and we, like you, will be eagerly waiting the 20th of April, which will be the release of all those firmwares.
That's right. So first we have an addition called pre-release capture, which is the first time we've seen something like this in a full-frame mirrorless camera. It did actually exist in the Nikon Z9 system, where essentially the camera begins to take photos before you actually fully depress the shutter button. So it just means that when you are a shooter that is perhaps taking pictures of wildlife or something hard to predict, as soon as you sort of press the shutter button even slightly, the camera starts to take pictures. With this pre-capture ability, it is only available in JPEG, which means for RAW shooters, no good as of yet. But seeing that there are other camera manufacturers that do allow RAW pre-capture shooting, as far as I understand, it does mean that we may see this from Nikon in the not too distant future. Here's hoping.
The good thing about it, the first step happened, and I'm sure that we're going to see a lot of people saying, well, what about RAW? So it will be now on the future list of improvements for Nikon. So I think it's possible, especially with a sensor like this, and we're going to talk about how much data it can handle in the video updates, because now we got 8K at 60 frames, we got 4K at 120 frames. So the processor can handle the data. So I'm sure that 20 frames RAW pre-recording is also possible. So in my opinion, we will see it in the future, maybe with 2.01 or could be a version 3 firmware.
Here's hoping. Next up, we have 20 types of custom wide area AF selection patterns that have been added. Now, this was something that we saw in the D6, and we wondered why it hadn't been included in the Z9 straight out of the box, but obviously Nikon have gone, makes a lot of sense to have that as an opportunity for sports shooters, so let's include it here.
Absolutely, and in my opinion, it actually was a lot easier to implement on Z9 because AF sensor is actually on the sensor themselves, while D6 had to have its own AF sensor below the mirror. So actually it was a software or firmware upgrade, and they finally made it. So I actually can see that a lot of those things we're going to see now, they probably were planned before the release of the camera, and it's just because the hardware was ready and the software wasn't ready, we start to see this version 2.0 coming out soon. And actually, it's April. The camera actually came out just before Christmas. So actually, having this major firmware update in 3 months is pretty good.
That's not too shabby. I'd like to add to that that there are 12 additional focus patterns available for video capture. But as I said, we'll talk more about video later. Next thing up is the new retouch menu feature, which is called Motion Blend. Now, this creates an in-camera overlay from a series of subject movements for continuous shooting into a single picture in camera.
Yeah, I think that was the most requested feature for Z9. So finally, I'm glad we have it. But if you're not sure what that is, think about multi-exposure on film camera with a lot more frames blended into the image. So that's all it is. And it's in retouch menu for a reason.
Yes. Now we have some AF improvements. So AF stability, tracking performance, and subject detection in low light situations has been enhanced. That's always downplayed, I think, by Nikon because they can't really quantify how much AF improvements have been made or by what percentage.
You can't really put a number on it, can you?
No,
Yeah.
But I'm very excited to see how that pans out in real life based on the videos that we've been seeing from those who did get a sort of sneaky, cheeky little pre-release access. It looks like it's very impressive indeed.
A lot of people who try the film where they're reporting improvements, I personally don't know how you can improve on that, but obviously is there. And I think maybe the low light and the tracking, those things that were improved, because especially for tracking, especially subject coming towards you, you want to get as much speed as possible. And in low light, again, to avoid the situation where the camera effectively will hunt, it's always good to get those improvements ready.
One that perhaps isn't so exciting, but maybe for a few of you, when reviewing images, users can now have the option to skip the first shot in a burst.
I wonder if that's to do with pre-capture.
Possibly.
Because otherwise, why would you want to skip the first shot?
I know.
I'm not quite sure. So I think it's to do with that really more than anything else, but you never know.
Then we have capturing star trails. So for our astrophotographers and long exposure photographers, Firmware 2.0 enhances the Z9's long exposure display to continue a live count of exposure time. Now, I know at least 2 people who specifically requested this went and asked me to feed that back to Nikon.
Yeah.
So I'm quite...
me and Becky.
It wasn't us. But I'm very, very glad for our astrophotographies that we now have that live countdown of exposure time. Users can also now dim the viewfinder further and with greater precision to preserve power and their night vision. So this is a nice little nod to those using the Z9 for professional astrophotography.
We also had a list of improvements which not only improve the stills photography, but also videography as well. But we're going to touch the video later on. So we're going to talk about EVF first. So we now have an option to select 120 frames per second in the viewfinder. Previously, we had 60 frames per second. This is pretty good. Think about it this way. One of the criticisms when Z9 came out compared to Sony A1 was that A1 allowed you to run the EVF at 120 frames per second. So now Z9 has it as well. Again, we talk about you buying the hardware, a lot of those extra features come by a software update. That means hardware is capable enough of those things, which is really, really good. So again, it's an option that you can select. And I guess 120 frames per second will give you this smooth frame rate. So you can't complain really. I mean, I couldn't complain about 60 frames per second.
No,
personally.
But people could.
We get used to good things really quickly.
That's right. We also have the auto exposure that has been enhanced to give more stable exposure with human faces. So if you have a subject that turns away and then looks back at the camera, or when the composition changes, it just means that the camera keeps that exposure rather than changing it.
Absolutely. The more stable exposure of the human face I can get, I'll take it.
We have improved prioritized viewfinder monitor mode.
It gives you a familiar shooting and review flow.
Yeah.
Just remember the good old days where familiar shooting and review flow felt just right.
And now we have that.
Exactly. And you bought Z9, you just didn't feel like the familiar shooting and review just wasn't right. I mean, the major complaint that we see in all reviews is familiar shooting and review just didn't feel right on Z9. So finally they brought it to the back so you can finally dust off your Z9 and start shooting.
Sarcasm is real. We have an option prefer sub-selector center, which has been added to the custom setting menu, which improves the operability of the sub-selector. So whoop-de-doo.
Selector.
We also have improvements to auto white balance, even when the scene changes rapidly, and adjustments to choose color temperature and preset manual white balance.
I like that. I think that's important.
Yes, Con is definitely someone who adjusts their white balance as they go. So
absolutely.
We have a new focus selection, focus point selection speed. This is a custom setting that allows users to adjust the speed that AF points can be moved through the frame. So if you're one of those move your focus point people, then that could be quite useful for you. We also have confirmation of high speed shooting. Visual shutter release indicators appear clearly on the display and the real live viewfinder.
We also got enhanced memory set recall function, enable instant recall for several focus positions. I know that a lot of wildlife photographers and sports photographers needed that feature, so I'm glad we have it.
We have recall shooting functions hold, which is now added to the conventional recalling shooting functions. So this allows users to maintain the record function without continuously pressing a button. And last up, we have an option to switch the focus control ring roles to help photographers who don't need manual focus to enjoy actually using the control ring.
So you can assign effectively to something else. Okay, that's very interesting. Okay, so
those are small things that a few people had mentioned when the Z9 firmware releases were coming. They were saying, oh, why haven't they added, this tiny thing or this tiny thing? So obviously this proves that Nikon are listening to feedback from their users.
And if you ask me, it's a quality of life improvement.
That's all it is. Right, shall we talk about video updates?
Yes, absolutely. The things we don't understand.
Well, we understand some of it at least in our limited Limited capacity.
Okay, well, the first one up is actually enabling of 8K at 60 frames per second in NRAW mode. So NRAW is a Nikon RAW video format, which you can now record internally in 8.3K. So it's actually bigger than 8K. So you can crop a little bit if you want to. So that's available in 60 frames per second. You also have 4.1K at 120 frames per second. And obviously the smaller formats as well as DX crops formats. You also have ProRes HQ available in 4K at 60 frames per second. So that's a larger format. It's Apple ProRes format. So if you do like that, it's available in 4K at 60 frames per second, but you can enable NRAW in 8.3K. So now NRAW is currently can be opened with the DaVinci Resolve software. So you can get a free version. You can also get a studio version. So that's available from there. We will expect Adobe to release an Adobe Premiere patch at some point. The new patch just came out. It actually doesn't include it, but hopefully next month we will see that. So that's that. Now we also have a host of just overall video improvements, and those are?
Well, we have the record symbol now visible through the viewfinder, so you don't accidentally press unrecord while you're videoing.
This is life-changing,
It's very important, actually. And the fact that it wasn't there before is a little bit surprising. But anyway, we also have the waveform monitor, which is quite a cool addition that confirms the brightness levels according to the subject position.
It's something that videographers would appreciate, and maybe our stills photographers, not so much because we don't know that. But the more people start to get into the videos, this becomes a norm.
We also have the video recording settings, which is almost like a mini iMenu that we sort of take as a given for still shooting, but for video recording, it just means that you can see your frame rate and audio, and it can all be confirmed on a single screen with the video info option.
Yeah, I personally hope that Nikon will make similar style menu for stills as well. We have iMenu, but it's quite small. I would like to have a full screen option, which tells me all the important settings and hopefully customizable as well. So I think it's really cool, very useful. If you have some external recorders like Blackmagic Recorder or Ninja Atomus, then you would have those options built in there. So now having this included in camera, you actually, what happens is you don't really need to have external recorder anymore because you've got your waveform, you've got your built-in NRAW 8K recording, you've got a little screen. So those features are really opening the door for videographers. So it becomes a videographer's camera. So according to many videographers, Z9 is the best hybrid camera on the market. Yes, it may be a little bit big for its size because of built-in grip, but it's still usable on proper sized gimbals, like DJI gimbals or Monza gimbals as well. So you can set up something like 2870 and start shooting with it. So the more features available, especially for free, because a lot of companies back in the day, like Panasonic, would charge the full RAW functionality. Or even to enable RAW on Z6, you would have to pay £200 and send it to Nikon for a special firmware update, effectively. So having this for free is really, really nice.
Indeed. We also have the final option of being able to adjust your ISO in 6th steps rather than 3rd stops, which enables finer exposure adjustment and prevents the ISO from increasing more than is needed.
Imagine you're coming from, let's say, dark areas to bright areas, or let's say slightly shady areas. It allows you to either overexpose or underexpose the images, but it's to make it less visible to the viewer. So that's quite cool. We had that feature available on cameras previously, and you would assign it to function 1 and function 2 button at the front. So now we have those in Z9 as well.
Very nice. We've got a couple of other settings. Fast AF on function, which allows the user to assign different AF speeds to separate controls. We've also got enable slow shutter video recording for extremely dark scenes or intentionally to introduce blur when shooting video. So very creative there.
Oh, absolutely. For the artists of the world.
That's right. And then we've got select frame rates with resolution settings. So we now have the ability to save consecutive frames in the selected section of video footage as a series of JPEG images while the playback is paused.
So effectively, it's a screen grab.
Exactly. Now, those Z9 updates are all coming together on the 20th of April. We will be testing our own Z9 sample before and after as soon as we can. Possibly. It's interesting that as part of this announcement and what you were saying about not necessarily needing an external recorder is that Nikon also announced that they're developing a 660 gig CFexpress card. So I wonder if they're kind of going, who needs an external hard drive when you can have this?
Absolutely. Also, what I think has happened is the reason why we have so many videos with so many tests. We have Ricci testing the memory card. We have Mark Granger testing the cards. We have other YouTubers who do check, we have comparisons between 10 different brands, etc., etc. I think it actually creates a lot more confusion to photographers getting into Z9. So having an offering from Nikon saying that this memory card will work with this camera, then it just makes choice for a lot of people easier. So if you don't want to spend time and you'll say hours for research, what is the best CFexpress card on the market, then you just go for the Nikon option.
Yeah. Now, it is made to meet the demands of the Z9 specifically. I'm sure that you can use it in other cameras, but the purpose of it is to keep up with those continuous high-speed shooting speeds and also 8K video at the high frame rates. It achieves read speeds of up to 1700 megabytes per second and write speeds of up to 1500 megabytes per second, which is on par with the Delkin Black memory cards.
Absolutely. And then obviously Nikon produced memory cards before in the past. It's highly likely that it's not made by Nikon themselves, but by a selected and approved manufacturer. Who this is, we don't know, but it seems like the cards in the past, like they had the XQD card, which was made by Sony, they worked really well. With Z9 out of the way, we also have a small announcements of Z6 II and Z7 II firmware updates. Now, the reason why it's quite small is puzzling to me.
I do wonder, and this is in Nikon's own word, they've said, in addition, firmware version 1.40 for the Nikon Z7 II and Z6 II has improved AF performance. This update will enhance the stability of the AF, preventing the focus point from unintentionally moving to the background. Now, they kind of downplayed the Z6 and the Z7 firmware updates that we saw last year, and then we put them through their paces, and it was a vast improvement of the autofocus.
Yeah.
And I do think they tend to do that with their firmware updates, where they say, oh, we've made this small AF improvement, and then hopefully in practice it will actually be markedly better than what they're saying.
Well, fingers crossed, because at the moment, because there's so little information out, I just want to see, is there a second processor that everyone is talking about is used for this autofocus system? Because obviously when the firmware has been rumored for a month, and I think we talked about it, it was announced in July back in the day, so it's almost 8 months since the announcement. And because the expectations are huge, I want to see, I want to test, I want to report on that. At the moment, I'm not 100% sure what is there.
They also added the ability to emulate linear focus with selected lenses. This will be added for manual focus focusers, I should say, manual focus photographers, so that users can smoothly adjust the focus position as intended with an operational feeling similar to cinema lenses.
Oh, I like that feeling.
So the firmware update also supports the MLL7 remote control, which has been out for 4 years almost, and really ought to have been enabled from the outset.
It's very strange because I thought it was just there, but I never used it. So it's very interesting to see actually this finally has been enabled. So that's good, and it will allow you to control the camera remotely, effectively.
Exactly. It was originally brought out for Coolpix cameras, P1000, I think, and then they added Z50 capability with the MLL7. The remote release WR11B has been discontinued as far as we know, so this will be a replacement for that.
All right, well, let's talk about another announcement, which is very interesting. And again, for us stills photographers, sounds a bit strange, but again, the videographers that watch our channel, 3 of them, I'm sure they'll let us know, but they've announced MC-N10 Remote Grip for Nikon Z camera, and it effectively allows you to attach it to video head of your tripod, and will allow you to control your camera from there.
Yeah. When I looked at it, I was confused because it basically looks like a grip portion of a camera.
And then where the screw goes in.
I mean, essentially they've just chopped up.
Yeah. No, you get a drill and you just make a hole and then you just attach it there.
That's it. I wasn't quite sure what it was, but essentially what it does is it allows you to remote control your Z-mount mirrorless cameras via a wired connection. It can control various functions of Nikon mirrorless cameras. So they say increasing video recording with a small screw and expanding the possibilities of video recording. But it also supports still shooting. Essentially, you can... Do you remember the old WR1, which was like it was like a giant TV remote for your camera? So it's like that, but in the form of a grip.
Well, in the much nicer form. It's definitely shaped for the hand and...
But yeah, if you look at the picture that they provided, there are far more buttons on the back that we can't see in the image, in the product image. Okay,
well, let's discuss what we can see. So we've got on and off switch with a shutter release button, effectively. So you can use forward focus as well. So we've got ISO button, the exposure compensation button, record button as well. And on the side of the leather grip itself, you got function 1 and function 2.
Yeah. And we have a wheel to tighten the grip. And we have the front sub-command dial, which is for usually adjusting your aperture.
Absolutely. Now, on another side, we don't really see it, but on the picture they provided of a videographer filming something, you can see a lot more buttons in there, and you can see the socket for USB cable. I assume it's a USB-C that allows you to connect the grip and the camera itself.
Then we have a main command dial, which usually controls your shutter speed. It looks like we have possibly one...
Like a little joystick.
Like yeah, exactly. Like a small D-pad.
Or like a thumbstick or something.
Yeah, to move your autofocus point around, I would imagine, or navigate menus and stuff. And then it looks like below that we do have an I menu button, an actual menu button. It's very difficult to tell from a tiny low-res picture, but does that look like release mode?
Yeah, it looks like zoom in and zoom out buttons there as well. So, and I'm not sure what's on the right-hand side of those, but it is an interesting one. I really wish they would release a proper high-resolution shot of that.
So that we can see what it's all about.
Absolutely. But I am looking forward to seeing actually videographers' reviews on that grip and telling us exactly what they can do with it. And obviously, we'll put it out and you can report as soon as we see them.
Yeah. Now, they haven't actually given a delivery date for that, but they say for further details, including pricing availability, it'll all come later. So watch this space. The Nikon CFexpress card is slated to be available starting June, and the suggested retail price in the US of A is going to be $729.95, excluding local tax.
Absolutely. And then both firmwares will be available on April the 20th on Nikon USA as well as Nikon Europe and Nikon Japan websites. And also you will be able to upgrade your firmware via SnapBridge app at a later date.
Well, hey.
Hey. Okay, so what are your thoughts on announcements, Becky?
Wow. My opinions. Okay. The big firmware update that we were expecting for the Z9, that's here now. It's all the things that we were told were going to be enabled are now enabled, right?
Yeah, there's no getting away from it.
No. So I will be interested to see primarily for my own purposes how it affects the stills shooting, but I am very glad that videographers have been fully supported with all these updates.
Yes, and we talked about Nikon Vision Report for 2025, but also looking at their previous talks and just their financial reports, they always were saying that we want to put the video features in our cameras. We want to have enable video functionality. The way they're releasing the lenses nowadays as well, they have minimal focus breathing, etc., etc. So it seems like it's a shaping up like a really, really good system for videographers. So in terms of this, having such a huge upgrade delivered when they promised it, it's quite amazing.
We're very impressed. We are, as sort of smaller Z-body users, mostly intrigued about what the Z6 II and Z7 II firmware updates are actually going to hold in reality. We will be testing those out at the earliest available opportunity, don't you worry.
Yeah, hold your skepticism, wait till 20th of April, and let's test it all together and see what happens. At the moment, I am not convinced. I'm a bit worried, but I think it's going to be okay.
Do you? We shall see.
I could be totally wrong.
Well, the proof of the pudding is, as they say, in the eating.
For more information on the firmware updates, I would recommend you a couple of videos to watch. So the first one is done by videographer Gerald Undone. His channel is based on videography and audio equipment for videography, etc., etc. He goes through the new firmware bit by bit, and actually for videographers, it's definitely an essential watch. It's called Nikon Z9 Raw 2.0 firmware, GOAT level.
Is it GOAT level firmware?
It is a GOAT level. I think it's basically, I wouldn't even call it Windows 11 over Windows 10. I think it's something like from Windows 95
to XP.
No, I wouldn't go that far. 98.
I was going to say, what's GOAT level? There was a big jump between in 95 and XP.
The thing about this firmware is interesting because they say in three months we went from 1.0 firmware, when we had 1.10 and 1.11 firmware, and then we went straight to 2.0. And I'm sure if they would just release the firmware with 8K 60 frames per second, everyone says, well done, Nikon, good job.
Yeah.
But actually, having a list of 25 improvements just for the camera, not bug fixes. Those, I'm sure there's a lot of going under the hood, but actually adding the features, especially like things like waveforms and, all those little features for videographers is incredible. I think this is very important. So yeah, for videographers, definitely do check this one out. But for still photographers, we have video from Seth Miranda. He talks on Adam Channel. The funny thing is he had literally the camera for 1 hour with a new firmware.
Yeah.
You can come and says, have a look at this. And the video he creates out of it is really, really good. So if you want to see someone talking passionately about firmware features of the camera, definitely check out Seth's video. And obviously, the last but not least, we have the GOAT himself, Richie Scherer.
He actually has had quite the sneak preview of the Z9 firmware update for understandable reasons. He is a Nikon man himself. So he talks all of the different things: new 8K 60 frames per second, 20 AF area modes, pre-capture, and memory cards tested.
For some of you who don't know, the GOAT is the greatest of all time.
Yeah, just in case you think we're calling people goats, we're not. Thank you very much for watching. Please give us a like and a subscribe. We're at 12,500 subscribers. This year we would like to go for 20,000. So tell your friends, tell your family. It's all very much appreciated. Have a wonderful Easter all. We will see you next week for another Nikon report.
And we will see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.